This is The Future of What? I'm Portia Sabin, and today we're talking about transparency in the music industry. Picture, if you will, an apple. It's red or green, it's crunchy and juicy. It's a very nice apple. And that apple has a market value. Now, picture a change in the world that results in everyone deciding that apples should be free. In that scenario, what happens to the people who plant and grow and harvest the apples? They still have a product, but they can't get paid in the way they used to. Now, picture that apple is in demand everywhere. Every time you turn on your TV and see a commercial, there's that apple. When you download an app for your phone, there's that apple. In the movies, in video games, in restaurants, there's that apple. In 2015, the music business is kind of like this. Everyone wants to use music because music sets moods. It creates emotions, it makes people want to dance. In other words, it has value. Yet the marketplace says it's free. This is the dilemma that people who make music find themselves in today. It still costs the same to record and press and promote an album, yet we can't sell this product like we used to. So those of us who produce the music, the artists and labels, have to wonder how long we can keep this up. Is there a future in music? Or what? The word on the street about the music industry has been the same for years. Labels don't pay artists. In fact, some people wonder why there are still labels. Meanwhile, label owners say,
they weren't relevant, then we wouldn't get 100 demos a week.
But are labels transparent? A recent study released by the Berklee College of Music appears to support this stereotype. But is it true? We discuss this right now on The Future of What? Panos Panay is the founding managing director of the Berklee Institute of Creative Entrepreneurship, and he joins us today to talk about a year-long study authored by Rethink Music that's been getting a lot of publicity. Panos, welcome to The Future of What?
Thank you so much, Portia.
So your organization, Berklee ICE, supports Rethink Music, which wrote this study concerning transparency in the music industry. Can you summarize the findings for us?
Yeah, sure. First, I should clarify that Rethink Music is an initiative of the Institute. So think of it as the think tank part of the Institute that looks into the future of music, hence Rethink Music. We see ourselves as being the preeminent institution of contemporary music in the world. And every year we graduate 1,000 new graduates that go into this industry. And we feel that we have a duty to our students to not only educate them about the industry, but also play an active role in the discussions of where the industry goes and how we make it into a viable ecosystem for everybody. In terms of the report, what we're finding is that we have an industry whose economic model and consumption model has completely changed in the last 10 years. We've gone from an industry where it was a largely an ownership model to a pay-as-you-go model. We went to an industry that's gone from dollars to largely an industry of cents and sometimes fractions of pennies. But at the same time, even though there's been enormous technological and consumption changes in the industry, we've also see that the underlying infrastructure of the industry in terms of all the intermediaries involved in it hasn't really changed. So we're asking some basic questions. Can new technology advances help bring transparency to the way that money flows from a consumer to a creator? Can it expedite the way that this money flows from consumer to creators? Are all of the intermediaries that have been historically part of this music business necessary, especially as we've seen that the amount of money that a consumer is willing to pay for music has decreased? And then lastly, we want to challenge perhaps a culture that has existed in the industry, and maybe even a culture that exists in Silicon Valley, around the way that creators ought to be treated. And that's effectively what we're addressing in the report.
So I started this radio show as a way to educate musicians and other people about just what really goes on in the music industry, because I think it's very opaque. People don't really get it. So how do you think this report fulfills that mission and is educational for musicians?
Well, first of all, we feel that musicians need, and not just musicians, but creative beings in general, they need to feel that they have to be a part of this conversation. So to some degree, perhaps some of the controversy that the report has done has fulfilled a bit of the objective of, let's just make it sort of a big enough topic that musicians and creators pay attention. To some degree, I feel that there's been a revolution happening the last decade or so, as I've mentioned, but the creative class has been largely absent from these conversations until recently. I think that our report, which has also stimulated an op-ed by David Byrne in the New York Times. So we think that by virtue of who we are, by virtue of the fact that we're putting something out there and we're putting our reputation behind it as an academic institution, that we're unearthing, bringing to the surface issues that are often missed by the creative class.
Just so everyone understands what we're talking about, transparency is basically allowing artists and labels to see where their money is coming from. And as the report points out, the technology exists to do this. But the report also mentions that a lot of streaming services don't want to invest in transparent reporting and accounting systems, which seems like a fundamental problem.
It's not just a streaming service issue, because if you talk to any of the players, they'll say, well, it's not really us, it's them.
Uh-huh.
There is really no easily accessible or publicly accessible, authenticated database that you can go and say, okay, I played this particular song by, you name it, Gloria Estefan, Taylor Swift. And because of the way that the creative process happens, without making it too complicated, you have multiple parties involved with every piece of every particular sort of creative piece, whether it's a song, whether it's an album. So often the streaming services say, well, we don't always have an easy way to know who to pay. So that's one issue right there, that there is no publicly accessible database where you know, okay, for every creative piece out there, the minute that it's streamed or played, you know exactly who you should get paid and who should get paid what. So that's one issue. The other issue is that on the label side, or often on the publisher side, you're looking at an accounting infrastructure that's arcane at best. So even the way that money flows, the way that it's accounted for, distributed, is fairly antiquated. Now labels may say and publishers may say, gee, the music industry has declined, we've been decimated, we had to cut staff, and so forth and so on. On the other end, I think you have, whenever you look at situations where you have lack of transparency, you always have to ask yourself, well, okay, are there incentives or disincentives associated with transparency or opaqueness to exist? Well, unlike situations where, let's say, you have abandoned property, that if somebody doesn't claim it, say it's a bank account, somebody dies, it's not claimed for, well, that abandoned property goes to the state. In the music industry, if you can't find who to pay, at the end of the year, that money gets distributed to largely the labels or publishers, which more often than not are owned by record labels based on market share. So you don't really have an incentive there for people to become more transparent, because guess what? Money that they don't pay out effectively becomes their property. So the objective of the report for us is not, gee, let's point the fingers out at labels. I mean, this concept of a black box is a fairly known issue within the industry. Unfortunately, you have a series of actors involved in the way that this money flows, where they all have their own individual incentives or disincentives to expedite the flow of this money or to track down the rightful owners. So for better or for worse, you have an infrastructure there that, partially by design, partially because of antiquated systems, partially because of culture, let's face it, hasn't always been quick to, let's say, expedite the flow and rightfully track down the rightful creators and recipients of these payments. Now, you may say, why is this urgent today? I mean, hasn't this problem always existed? Look, in one way or another, the problem has always existed. The proliferation of streaming services has only exacerbated the issue just because of the complexity involved in the way that the money is collected and attributed. But, the other issue around the paper that we bring up is that today you also have technology that should make these problems go away pretty easily, number one. Number two, there is a lot of discussion in the media about, gee, streaming services have killed the record business and artists are not making any money. Well, again, you're looking at two issues there. Number one, yes, let's re-examine the economic models of these streaming services. Let's re-examine the motivations of these streaming services. Fine. Let's also not forget that less than 10 years ago, we were staring at the abyss with respect to piracy. So we should look at streaming services not so much as the enemy, but ultimately as entities that have helped legalize the consumption of music. So can we find a way to all work together to make their economic models viable? But then because of the way that the economics trickle down to the artists, I feel we should also examine the role of all the intermediaries and say, well, are all these people who have their hands in the way that this money is distributed and they all take a piece, are they still relevant in 2015? Are they all needed? Maybe they were needed in 1965, in 1975, in 1995, maybe then in 2005, but are they relevant in 2015, especially with the technology that we have?
Panos Panay is the founding managing director of the Berklee Institute of Creative Entrepreneurship. Panos, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Portia.
Coming up on The Future of What, we talk to musician and blogger David Lowery about his take on this study. I'm Portia Sabin. Stay with us. Go now to musician and blogger David Lowery. So you've written several posts about this Berklee Rethink Music study. Can you tell us who funded the study and why that's important?
It appears from the statements on the report that it's funded by Cobalt Music, which is a music publishing administration sort of company. But what's interesting about Cobalt is at least somewhat funded, certainly has a fairly large investment from Google through their Google Ventures. So when we see that begins to make us somewhat suspicious because, Google owns YouTube, and if there's any place where we're lacking transparency in the music business is what the heck goes on with YouTube?
Exactly.
What are we being paid for? How are we being paid? How is that calculated, et cetera, et cetera?
So this study focuses on the money that's being paid out to artists by labels and publishers, but not really on where that money is coming from, as you said. And in my opinion, transparency should begin there.
Yes, absolutely. That's basically what we're getting at, is that we realize there is always going to be some sort of black box money at the PROs, BMI and ASCAP, at the labels and distributors and such, because with the number of songs out there, there's always going to be some money that doesn't get assigned somewhere. But if you look at the grand scheme of things, that is a smaller black box than what we see at the digital distributors. What I'm concerned about is that there's actually more of an issue with transparency on digital services side, like how are they generating revenue? How much are their expenses in generating this revenue? Which ads, for instance, on the ad-supported side of things in Spotify and YouTube, which ads get assigned to the artist revenue streams and which ones don't? Because this isn't totally clear, and there's no real information on this.
Right. And my favorite part about what you said in one of your posts had to do with, the difference between a black box, let's say, that Sound Exchange would have had, and we're about to talk to Mike Huppy, the president of Sound Exchange. And the black box that Sound Exchange was dealing with was money that came in and that they were unable to find the proper place for. But they have no incentive. They have no stake in holding on to that money. They would like to pay it out to artists and labels. But with something like Spotify, let's just take Spotify as an example, with a streaming service, as you point out, they shouldn't even have this problem if they were doing their licensing properly in the first place.
Right. One of the problems with why there's a black box at the streaming services is that they sort of, at least in my case, it looks like they just put my entire song catalog up there without really checking to see if they had licenses for everything. Like some things they had licenses for because some of my music is published by a major label or administered by a major label, but some of it isn't. And so in my case, it looks like they just put it out there without obtaining the licenses first. So that makes it very difficult for them to pay right? Now, they appear to be retroactively going back and trying to find some of these or to obtain some of these licenses, but I know that there's a good 50 or 60 of my songs out there that they're using without a proper license. So that would make it very difficult for them to pay me. There's another issue in there, though, also as well. See, when we're told that, for instance, like 50% of the revenue or 70% of the revenue or 60% of the revenue, depending on the service, is being paid out to rights holders, there's also usually a caveat in there that it's minus the fees that are associated with sort of the fees associated with obtaining this advertising, right? There's probably fees paid out to brokers who, sort of essentially collect advertisers who want to advertise on these services. And there is zero transparency there. We don't know who those brokers are, what these expenses are that are charged back against the advertising revenue. And sometimes, at least I suspect in the case of YouTube, it's essentially Google's advertising wing paying itself and deducting expenses before the revenue is sort of put into the pie to be divided up between rights holders and YouTube. So you see what I'm saying? Like there's also this sort of non-transparency in what those expenses are to obtain the advertising that seem to be fairly significant.
Absolutely. As you say in one of your posts, you say 70% of X. Well, that doesn't help us because we don't actually know what that X is. I mean, that's an important part. And that's something that, that's why people have record deals. I mean, I think it's an interesting report. I don't want to be 100% negative to it because one of the things we just spoke to Panos Panay, who works for Berkeley ICE, and he was saying that one of the reasons they published this report was to bring issues that are important for musicians to know about into the open. And listen, you can't fault that. I think transparency is an important issue. I think that more musicians need to understand the business side, et cetera. But there are some very problematic parts of this report, one of which is that right now we've got a situation where people don't have access to information about how much money services like YouTube are making in advertising revenue.
Right. Even Wall Street has complained about this.
Right, which
when
seems
Wall
impossible.
Street is saying that YouTube and Spotify and all these services are completely non-transparent, you can't get a blacker pot calling a kettle black.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. It's like the ultimate.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So yeah, this call for transparency, I think, is wonderful. I think there's some good things in the report, but I just don't understand how you can do that without also trying to, shed light onto the digital services. And is this because essentially they're funded in some way through YouTube, Google, or that at least there's some sort of financial connection there? Is that why that was omitted? Was it uncomfortable for the authors to do that? Was it just an oversight? But, it's something that's worth questioning.
Well, my main interest in discussing this study on this show is that I believe we have a serious PR problem in the music industry, and we have for years. And that is just, that this study went for the low-hanging fruit, which is, labels take artists' money. Well,
right. Which
tell us
we do.
Something we don't
I
know.
have a label, too. I'm an artist, and I also have a label. We do take artists' money, but it's usually because we've spent money, like, promoting that album or, marketing or, hiring a publicist or tour support and things like that, right?
Right.
We do take, speaking as a label owner, we do take artists' money, but...
Right, but there's a difference between recouping your expenses and taking your agreed-upon portion, which you have a contract with the artist for, which is 50% or 60% or whatever you have agreed to, and stealing money, taking money away that should be rightfully for the artist. And I think that, the problem I have with this report is that's how it was publicized was, 20 to 50% of money does not make it to artists. And that's just
Right.
completely misleading and unfair.
Well, first of all, that quote is based on anonymous sources without actually any data to back it up. I don't doubt that 10% doesn't make it to artists. I mean, it's a messy business.
Right.
There's a lot of rights holders out there and stuff like that. But at the same time, if it was really 50%, you're talking billions of dollars in fraud. I'm not sure you have kind of an Enron style fraud going on here, and nobody's calling their lawyers or their accountants or even, the attorney generals and stuff like that. So again, I'm also suspect of that 20 to 50% figure. It seems high to me, and it's not really supported with anything. So I don't know. It's not supported with any data. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's just attributed to anonymous sources, which is
Yes.
always suspect.
It is. It is. It's very, and the whole report has sort of a problem of authorship as well, where it's like, where are the authors? There are no names on this report, which
Right.
is odd.
What did your last guest, did he shed any light on who authored the report? Because it's not clear from the report itself who authored it. And
Nope, he didn't, although he was quite supportive of the report, and he certainly was taking ownership of it. He wasn't taking authorship, but yeah.
Right.
So the one last thing I wanted to ask you about quickly is that early in the report, the authors, whoever they are, quote someone as saying, streaming services have no incentive to invest in transparent reporting and accounting systems, which are expensive. And I just thought, what an interesting, no incentives?
Well, they have a fiduciary responsibility to pay those whose music they're using. I think that's a crazy pants statement right there. Because I mean, say I'm a songwriter, right? I didn't ask Spotify to get into the business. Oh, okay, we'll distribute your songs. Oh God, now we have to figure out how to account for these songwriters.
They begged us and begged us. Please, please, stream
They
our music.
begged us to get into this business. I mean, we
Right.
didn't beg them to get into this business.
Right.
And are you telling me that, wait a minute, are you telling me that the computer technology industry can't solve this problem?
Right. If they can't.
And they want artists to solve it? I mean, come
Right.
on, we can't even keep the van clean.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so that's a little crazy there too. It's like they have no, well, I think they do have an incentive in just that they're in the business and they need to account for this stuff. But that does illustrate the attitude. I mean, it's sort of like what I've shown with my catalog is that, there are a lot of songs they're using and somebody hasn't done the licensing properly, and they could have got a compulsory license using the federal statutes anyway. But that hasn't even been done, which makes me want to turn around and, the first place I'm going to look if there's a problem with transparency is at the digital services, which clearly haven't obtained all the proper licenses for my catalog.
Well, right, exactly. And the fact that we can't have a conversation about how much a stream is worth because that stream value changes depending on, the territory and the time of day. And I don't know whether it's ad supported. I mean, there's so many ifs that we can't even really tell you what the value of a stream is.
Right. So we don't even know if it's a good deal for us or not.
Right.
From an individual artist's viewpoint, it's really difficult to figure out if the streaming services are a good value for us or not. Right? Because we can't even tell what we're being paid. Right?
Correct.
For a while there, here's another interesting thing too. For a while there, some of the labels that I've talked to I'm not sure how they were licensing, if they were licensing directly with Spotify, if they were going through distributors or what, but they could see the difference between the paid streams and the free ad-supported streams and see the difference. And then other labels are not able to do that, and they just have it all lumped together, right?
Right.
So there's a very basic bit of transparency that we could use right there, which is like, can we see the difference between how much I'm getting paid per spin on the paid service versus the ad-supported service?
Right.
But because, for instance, in the case of Spotify, it's an IPO-driven company. It's going to want to have as many users as possible, and they do not have an incentive to split between, the free and the paid tier.
Right.
Right?
Absolutely. David Lowery is a musician and blogger. You can find his writing at thetricordist.com. David, thanks so much for being on our show.
Thanks for doing the show.
Welcome back to The Future of What? I'm Portia Sabin. Today we're talking about transparency in the music industry. Our next guest is Michael Huppy, President and CEO of SoundExchange. Mike, thanks for coming back to The Future of What?
Portia, happy to be back.
So can you explain for those who don't know how SoundExchange was created and why?
Sure. SoundExchange was created by the industry to help organize and make sense of and administer part of the new digital economy. We are at the center of a lot of digital radio services here in the U.S. We have over 2,500 services that pay us for the use of music on digital radio, and then we pay it out 50-50 to artists and record labels. We pay it out quicker and more efficiently than anybody else in the world.
That was very concise. That's perfect. So some of the players, those 2,500 companies that you're talking about, are like Pandora, that kind of a thing?
Exactly. So, it's the internet radio services like Pandora and iHeartRadio. Obviously, there's also satellite radio, Sirius XM, but also other things such as music choice on your cable television and things of that nature. So it's really a variety of audio-only streaming radio products. So it does not include download products or things like that.
And specifically, these are all the non-interactive services, correct?
Exactly. So the lean back experience where you have either program curated and fed to you, or perhaps it's customized to your taste, but it's not on demand. For that, you have to go straight to the record label, not through SoundExchange.
So the Berkeley report that we've been talking about today cites SoundExchange as an example of one of the players who's getting it right in the music industry today. And by getting it right, I mean getting money from services to labels and artists with a good amount of transparency. Can you tell us what you guys have been doing over the last 10 years to achieve this?
Sure. And, obviously transparency is a huge focus for us. It's something that we pride ourselves on. And we've spent the better part of a decade getting to the space where we are now. And there's lots of things we do to promote transparency. First and foremost, we are huge proponents of data and open data and accurate data throughout the entire industry. We are pushing everybody to make sure their metadata is correct, report their metadata to us so that we can help make the money flow the right way in this digital radio space. Another thing that we've done is we have created what I think is probably the best sound recording repertoire database in the world. We have over 4,000 rights owners, mostly labels, but really anybody who owns master rights. We've had them submit to us their metadata, and we now have, somewhere north of 25 million tracks, 18 million unique ISRCs, and we handle all the conflicts that come out from that. Where we have multiple people claiming the same track, we work out the conflicts and figure out who the actual owner is. So we've done a lot to clean up data. Another thing we're doing is we are pushing the use of ISRC. I know the Berkeley report and quite frankly a lot of other reports have talked about ISRC for your listeners, the International Sound Recording Code, that was supposed to be the international serial number for every recording so we could all track exactly what recordings are being used. It has not been implemented perfectly, and it's not been utilized around the world in the same way. So we are pushing very hard to make ISRC the standard, to have services report ISRC to us. And we've done a lot of other things. We're building a new software platform that's very open and flexible. We've created a portal that all our payees can go to massage and play with and do analysis on their data. And I could go on and on. I've probably already talked too long.
Well, one thing I want to go back to is how you said that basically you guys have worked hard with the services who report to you to help clean up the data. And so people understand that means a service like Pandora or a service like iHeartRadio, you're basically dealing with data where like a DJ, for example, would write down what songs he or she played. But the problem is, what if that information they write down is incomplete, right?
Right. And it varies, sometimes it's a DJ writing down, sometimes it's more sophisticated. And some of these services are actually getting feeds from the labels now. So there's the whole gamut of how a service might get the metadata. But the data that comes into us is far from perfect, I would say. In many cases, it's pretty bad. Sometimes it's pretty egregious, where you just have flat out wrong data or blank fields. Other times there are things that might be understandable. For instance, if you have a compilation CD that's distributed by label A, but the sound recording on it was owned by label B, we all know that label B is the sound recording owner and the rights owner. But many people would look at whoever put out the compilation as the rights owner. So we often get incorrect ownership information. We have misspellings. We sometimes have just a variety of errors like that. And part of what our job is, a very important part of our job, is to take that data that comes in from the services in far less than perfect format and do our best to clean it up so the right people get paid. Because, you were talking earlier with one of your guests about the incentive for services to build these immense systems to properly deliver data. And I think, your discussion hit it on the head. Services are about pushing out music and doing everything as cheaply as possible in order to maximize their profit. And that means that they may have less incentive than, say, Sound Exchange does to make sure the data is accurate.
Right. Well, short of sending a big guy in brass knuckles over to a radio station,
Right.
how do you provide an incentive to people to clean up their data?
Well, if they use the statutory license that we administer, which those 2,500 labels do, they're kind of on the honor system when they initially send the data. So every month we get from all those services, we get data and payments. And we go through this very complicated process that I just described to you. But a couple things. First off, we have the ability to audit, and we always have 6 or 8 or 10. We always have a fair number of audits going to try to check in on the services and make sure that they're reporting properly. And then, to be honest, we try to work with them at the operational level. We obviously have our commercial differences with these services. The most obvious example, we're in a rate court right now just debating what rates they should pay to use the music. You can imagine we have different views on that. But aside from stuff like that, at the end of the day, these people are, in a way, they're business partners because, we want digital radios to succeed. We want all of these services to do well. We just want to make sure they pay fairly for the music, and we want to make sure they report properly so that we can pay it out to the right people. And so, really at an operational level, we have pretty good relationships, especially with a lot of the bigger services, in trying to work through things like data cleanup and trying to make it the most efficient process.
So since you guys are compiling this very clean, good database of all these songs, do you think there's another application for that database that you're putting together?
There are many applications of what we could do. I mean, and our thinking is anything we can do to better the metadata in the whole industry is good for everybody. The good news is we're a nonprofit, right? So all we will ever take out of the revenue stream is what it takes to run our operations. But if we can do something to just help the money flow better in all parts of the industry or in all parts of the recording side of the industry, then maybe it's helping do data exercises. Maybe it's do matching with certain services to try to find artists or labels who haven't signed up. Perhaps it's matching up ISRCs to the actual recording and making that information public so people can come and do an ISRC lookup and figure out which label's attached to it. Or imagine in a perfect world, what we've all talked about, and I think you've probably talked about before on earlier shows, is imagine if you could find a place where you would marry up the ISRC and the ISWC, which is the basically a serial number for the song. Imagine one place where you could go and get all you needed to know, recording, publishing, who produced it, everything about a particular recording. That would be a very good thing for the industry.
That would. Mike Huppy is president and CEO of Sound Exchange. Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Portia. Always a pleasure to be with you.
This is The Future of What, a show about the music industry. I'm Portia Sabin, president of the independent label Kill Rock Stars. If you missed any of the first part of this show or want to hear past shows, you can go to killrockstars.com/thefutureofwhat or find us at the iTunes store.
I've been away, been in some kind of bind. I jumped the fence, put order to my mind. Shake the weight of this life off and say, there stands the path. It's my first one today. Do you wonder where your boy has gone? Obliterated and started over on my own.
Jeremy Devine is the founder and owner of Temporary Residence Limited. Jeremy, thanks for joining us on The Future of What?
Thanks for having me.
So today we're talking about transparency in the music industry, and I wanted to talk to you because you, like me, run a small independent label, and paying royalties to your artists is a very important part of your business, correct?
Sure.
Yeah.
It is. Very much so.
Now, do you do the royalties yourself?
I do. I'm doing them right now.
As we speak, your hands
As
are on
we
the keyboard.
speak, I am doing them right now. This interview is a quote-unquote early dinner break from royalty statements.
There you go, see? So how many times a year do you do royalties?
4 times.
Yes, you and I are the same. We are two crazy people in this industry, but yes.
You do them quarterly?
I do them quarterly, and I do it myself.
Yeah. I don't know anybody else that does them quarterly. Now I do.
Yeah, just the two of us.
That's awesome.
How'd you
Everybody
get started doing
that I ever talked to, because it seemed right. I don't have a great reason for it. I started the label to put out my own music, and getting paid every 6 months as an artist seemed really tough. But I think honestly it was just I didn't know any better. I started it and I based a lot of what we were doing off of Touch and Go and Discord, and I knew that those guys paid out 50-50 net profit splits, but I don't think I even knew what their schedule was or any details or even how they accounted. All that stuff I sort of learned as I went, and the quarterly thing just seemed right to me. And then it actually turned into kind of a boon over the years, because we would start working with bigger artists who we would find out that one of the tipping points for them for working with us versus working with another label is because we account every quarter instead of account every 6 months, so they don't have to make one payment every 6 months stretch for 6 months.
Yeah.
And it becomes more reliable as a lot of them get older and they start having families, mortgages, and all that kind of stuff. And then, when they're not touring all the time, then it becomes a thing where the royalties from us become a more significant part of their monthly and semi-annual and seasonal income. So it's made a lot more sense. It is a lot more work for us than I thought about when I first started doing it, but it's kind of an impossible thing to go backwards and try and sell the idea to artists of doing it every 6 months now that they've gotten used to 20 years of it being every 3.
Absolutely. And also, I don't know about you, but I find that if I were to try to do it every 6 months instead of every 3 months, I actually forget how to do it.
Yeah, no, I did it. We have a handful of artists who we only work with in North America, and so we license their records from another territory, and the license agreements call for us to account every 6 months. So we only do those records every 6 months, to be in accordance with the agreement. And I go through exactly what you're talking about. Like when I go through it, I realize I don't remember what's happening here.
Yep.
Like I don't remember what's happening with this account because it feels like it's been forever.
Right.
Since this is happening. And there's no issue with getting anything wrong because it's all hard numbers that are sitting in front of me. It's just I have to account for twice as many of them, like twice as much activity, because I'm only doing it twice a year as opposed to 4.
Right.
And I realize it happens every time. And without fail, all of the 6-month accounts are the ones that I end up doing last because they're in a totally different rhythm and pace than the others.
It's
so I end up burning through everything else first, and then I wait until the end. It's like that scene in Huey's Big Adventure where he keeps coming back to the snakes. And And he realizes that he has to save the snakes, but he'll save them after he saves all the other cuter animals.
Yep, cuter animals first. Totally.
So the 3-month accounts are my cuter animals.
Yes, they are. I totally agree. So do you use software, or did you just sort of cobble something together to do your royalties? Like, how did you come up with your system?
In the way that an artist who loves to make stuff and doesn't want to account would make. Like, I wanted to account, like I wanted, basically as somebody who's like not passionate about accounting.
Gotcha.
You know,
Yes.
I'm passionate about numbers. I love numbers and I have a weird fixation on them, but I'm not passionate about accounting. I do it because it's a thing that has to be done and I refuse to do it wrong, but I don't enjoy doing it. And so the system is set up, and we're actually in the middle of, well, probably at the very beginning of designing everything from scratch. Like, we're going to overhaul everything and start doing it, basically automate as much as humanly possible, because the ingestion of it and this is probably a decent segue, the ingestion of it in digital music realm is becoming really taxing.
Yes.
You know, like it's getting increasingly overwhelming because of how many different revenue streams there are.
Right. So tell us exactly, where do you get your information from? Do you have a distributor that feeds you this info, or do you have
we do.
direct deals?
So we're distributed by SC Distribution, who we've worked with for, I don't know, maybe 17 years. I mean, whenever they started, 97 or 98. So they distribute our physical and our digital, and they account to us once a month. And the way that they account to us is split up into 2 streams, basically. It's physical sales and digital sales. And then we have 2 people in the office here, myself and then my coworker Tommy, and Tommy does all of the digital because he's our digital content manager.
Mm-hmm.
So he handles all of the digital accounting, and then I handle all the physical accounting, and then he gives me the digital accounts as summaries, and then I include those summaries into our sort of grand summary statement that goes to each artist.
Right.
So they're all cross-collateralized, you know, like it all goes into one pot to pay towards the account. But from a format perspective, you know, I handle the physical from the ingestion period of it, and then he handles the digital from the ingestion. And the physical really hasn't changed. And
Right.
the 20 years we've run the label, the digital keeps changing.
Right.
And it keeps expanding, and it gets, I mean, it's not as mysterious as people, some like that I keep seeing. I think you had mentioned before the David Byrne article. It's not mysterious, at least on our end. I mean, what we see is exactly what we end up accounting for. And what we get from SC Distribution is exactly what they get from iTunes and Spotify and RDO and Amazon MP3 and all of those things. It's completely transparent. And the David Byrne article that keeps coming up about calling for labels to be more transparent than they have been. I'm not to be mean about it, but I can't read anything else into his statements other than he's working with the wrong people. I mean, seriously, the things that he describes, the problem he describes, just sound like either someone with his pedigree shouldn't be working with people who are that disorganized, or if it's malicious, then someone with his pedigree shouldn't be working with crooks.
Right.
You know,
Right.
and those are the only 2 options to have the result that he describes. Like, if it's actually true that people are being as opaque as they're apparently being in his experience, they're either completely stupid or they're completely crooks.
Right.
Because everything that he talks about, and I read that article to make sure because I knew you had wanted to talk about that idea, the idea of transparency. But, I mean, it's right there in front of you. You know, I mean, it's not, I'm not saying I believe him. I believe what he's saying, that he, you know, that it's really unclear how the royalties are being split, and it might actually be arbitrary. I don't know. It's not fun to account for that stuff, but it's not hard.
Right.
You know, like, it's long work. It takes forever to do. It takes us about 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks to account, which makes it tough to be accounting every quarter because it means we're spending, you know, a third of every quarter just accounting for that quarter. But it's just work. It's like, it's monotonous and it's not fun, but there's nothing complex about it, but like that there's nothing, it's just numbers. There's
Right.
nothing about it where we're splitting everything 50-50. So
It's not rocket science, as you say. If we can figure out how to do it, it's like other people should be able to.
yeah, like we'll get, a consolidated per track amount of revenue, and that's it.
Right.
You write it and you're like, okay, made $464 off of this track.
Right.
There's that one. And you just keep going through, and you go through track by track, and then you end up with an album, and then it just splits, and all of that stuff is just set up in accounting for us. Like it's already been designed. So
Right.
it's just plugging numbers in and then paying artists out. And by all means, we're always more than happy to send anybody anything that they want, as deep in the minutia as they wish to go. It just never happens.
Right. Let me ask you about that.
Yes.
So do you send a paper statement or a digital statement to your artists?
So we send hard copy paper statements to anyone who's getting a check,
Okay.
because since we already have to mail a check, we mail the hard copy statements so that there's a reference attached to what the check's for.
Gotcha.
And then otherwise we send, regardless, everybody gets a digital statement that is that same paper statement that's basically just turned into a PDF.
Right.
That just says, here's everything, here's all your accounting summary, and there's a lead up sort of email that I'll send to it that explains everything. And a lot of it's the same exact thing every quarter, is just defining terms, because anyone, it's 3 months, and 3 months is kind of a long time if you only get these emails once every 3 months.
Right.
It's easy to forget what the terms mean. It's easy to forget where you were the previous quarter, like those kinds of things. So I send out sort of an introductory email that just says hello to everybody and explains what all the terms are and yada, yada, yada. And then it's just a PDF of everything, and it says, if there is money owed to you, a check is in the mail with a hard copy of the statement.
Right.
And, and then it also says if you need any further details, or if you need the statement to essentially be expanded, we're happy to do that. It's just so much work on our end, and we have so many titles that there's no sense in us doing it when it turns out that 99% of the people don't want it.
So do you find artists asking you questions about their statements ever?
It's pretty rare. I mean, there's a handful of artists that will ask, or managers on behalf of artists who will ask. But for the most part, our statements are intentionally simple. They're more or less dummy proof, in the sense of, like, when I designed the statement, I designed it so the statement basically simplifies with each step, simplifies in terms of the way that you read it. So that and that was because early on when we were working with 2 artists or 3 artists, a couple of those artists had come from other labels or were currently working in other bands on labels, and they would say, I feel like every time I get this statement, like I'm out of my element, that I need a degree in some sort of business affairs to understand what is happening here. And this was before, this was in the 90s, before like digital was even a thing.
I know. And I think I have also received those statements because, of course, we have, for example, licensed songs to major label compilations, stuff like
Sure.
that. And, I think that's probably what the David Byrne article was really talking about, is you get these statements and it's completely unclear to you, first off, even what song they're talking about. Like, often the name of the song isn't anywhere on the statement.
Absolutely. Especially nowadays, we'll basically just have ISRCs.
Right. And then just rows of numbers and not connected to anything. And I mean, to me, it's really difficult because the whole point of this radio show is to try to counteract the bad PR that's gone on for so long about, labels are terrible and they just try to steal artists' money. But you have to, it sort of begs the question, guys, if you're going to send out statements that look like that, you're not doing anyone any good. You look like you're trying to steal people's money because you're so opaque.
Part of me thinks that the only people who are really stealing that kind of money aren't trying to hide it. I mean, in the sense, like, they don't care.
Right.
They don't care that, like, they've long gotten over the, like, sort of cartoonish villain role, of the music industry, where it's like, this is what we do. We were the modern music industry that we know was started by lawyers, and this is what we do. Like, we figure out ways to own everybody's stuff forever and not pay what it's fairly owed. I mean, that's the whole Cheap Trick thing years ago with iTunes, where, they started finding like breakage and return fees for MP3s on their statement.
Right, right.
And it's like, these are all of these weird ways where they can keep screwing you over, and they meaning like not major labels in general, well, probably major labels in general, but these situations that they find, the David Byrne situation, and I don't know who, Reprise, I'm not sure who put out Talking Heads, but it's a major label. And so those kinds of situations are the exact wrong example of what a label does, you know, and there's that podcast, The Pitch, that you were on, where they asked this sort of an entire podcast dedicated to what's the point of a record label.
Right.
And the examples that they had were really bad, you know, to begin with. And the other thing, I really like that podcast. I just think that particular episode didn't really address the fact that, in large part, the thing that they said at the beginning that record labels do, record labels still do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, all the stuff where they're like, they used to pay for a record to be made and pay for the promotion and market it and get it out there and distribute it.
What do you think we do?
This is everything that still happens.
We do that.
I mean,
right.
all of these, like, if they weren't relevant, then we wouldn't get 100 demos a week.
Right. Exactly.
Like, there's a reason why, like, people still want it, and that's because it's still relevant and it's still a service. It's still a thing that we do, and we're happy to do, and we want to do it. The transparency issue really kind of confounds me, because I get it because I've seen it. The thing you're talking about, we'll license songs to films, TV, or compilations, or soundtracks, or whatever. I've seen it, and I've had friends who were on major labels and have seen what a statement looks like, and it's nuts.
Mm-hmm.
And I get it. I totally get where somebody like David Byrne is coming from, but I hate how quickly it gets pulled up into, oh, well, that's just what labels do.
Me too.
And it's like, well, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, and that's what we're doing here,
right.
is we're trying to counteract that. And clearly that you guys do a great job of, I mean, it sounds like when you first have an artist, when you first are talking to an artist, you talk to them about this royalties process.
Yeah, I mean, it comes up, and we try and bring it up every quarter when we send royalties, just to make sure that nobody ever gets left out or that something gets sort of swept under the rug or not addressed, especially now because there's format changes. And so we'll have conversations every 6 months or 9 months. It's like, okay, guys, well, so Apple Music is now a thing that's going to be happening, and here's what that means or does not mean to you.
Right.
And in most cases, you know, to be honest with you, most cases artists are just like, this is the whole point of having a label, so that I don't have to care or deal about this stuff. Like, do what you do and participate in the things that you know and think are right and done the right way, and don't participate in the things that you don't. And I trust your judgment on that either way. And I have no reason to not trust you until something comes up that I find out was shady. And that's never happened, you know?
Right.
And it's not hard to be, the transparency thing is crazy. I mean, and I guess it's crazy to me because it's not in my universe. The labels and the artists that I work with on a regular basis don't have these problems.
Right.
You know, I mean, the thing that, and I keep coming back to David Byrne only because that's the current artist. And because he owns a label, one of his stories about it is that he owns a label and his distributor would not give him exact transparent statements of where the streaming royalties are coming from. And his distributor told him to have their lawyer talk to his lawyer.
Whoa.
And it's just like, if that's true, then you're just working with tons of the wrong people.
Right. Get away. There's lots of other distributors in the world.
There's tons, like, for somebody like that, there's no reason for you to be in that world anymore.
Right. That's
There's
true.
absolutely no reason for you to be in that world. And you're probably not making as much money
as you could
be.
Come to the independent sector. Come, David Byrne.
Stuff like that drives me crazy, you know, because it's just like, there's a whole world that is doing right by a lot of people, and people are making careers out of it.
Yeah.
You know, like, you don't have to get rich off of it, but we have artists, multiple artists, who own homes, and that is their only source of income. Absolutely.
I mean, I'm pretty sure I send more quarterly to the Decemberists than Capitol does.
Probably.
I would bet I do.
I mean, and I don't think most artists in that situation who have jumped from an indie to a major, I don't think there are very many artists who have a different perspective on that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's always going to be an example every decade or so, like a Modest Mouse, you know, or a Death Cab. I don't know. Like, those are examples where I could think, okay, maybe. I mean, you might be making more money on a major because you're so big.
Right.
And you get, you know, at that point, when you have a major single that's become a sort of a zeitgeist moment in pop culture, then you're in a different planet. I mean, it's a totally different perspective, and I can't claim at that point that you're not getting paid a lot of money.
Right.
But yeah, in a situation like a Decemberist or any artist that does that jump, or like when Interpol went to Capitol, I have to assume they made nowhere near as much money on the short period they were on Capitol as they have on Matador.
Yeah, absolutely.
And most artists, I think, are like that, unless you really shoot the moon. If you were selling a couple 100,000 records on indie and then you jumped and you sold 5 million.
Right.
And then it's like, well, okay, I mean, that was never going to happen on an indie.
Right.
But good for you. But it's like that's a 1 in a 50,000 chance.
Absolutely.
That sort of thing is going to happen. So, yeah, I mean, the transparency thing is weird to me because it just seems like really a no-brainer.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a little shocked that like we're having a conversation about it because
Right.
I didn't realize that was a thing, and that's probably just me being naive. But I didn't realize that was like a serious problem until you had gotten in touch, and I was like, wait, I don't understand what she's asking. To talk about the transparency, I was like, that's something I've literally never thought about.
Right.
I've never thought like, oh, we're doing this thing that other people aren't doing. And it's just like this is the only way that we know how to do it,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, see, you're doing the right thing. You guys are one of the good guys.
Excellent. You did it right.
And on that note, Jeremy Devine is the founder and owner of Temporary Residence LTD. Jeremy, thanks so much for joining us on The Future of What?
Thank you so much for having me.
My eyes roll around, out of my control. I'm looking through shades of light, and I could make a list of all the looks I stole, and it would be a waste of a good percentage of the words.
And that's our show. The songs we played today were used by permission of the artists. You heard Cracker, Bonnie Stillwater, and Milagres. And of course, our theme song, Mind Your Own Business by the Delta 5. If you have a question you want answered on the show, please email us at thefutureofwhatshow@gmail.com. Our episodes are archived at killrockstars.com/thefutureofwhat, and you can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. Our program was engineered by Reed Harvey and is produced by John Sepulvedo and Will Watts. Thanks to Digital One Studios in Portland. I'm Portia Sabin, president of Kill Rock Stars. See you next week.